Deep in Maine's isolated wilderness, 3 women ran what seemed to be a spiritual retreat for more than 3 decades. Over 600 women came seeking religious restoration, yet less than half ever made it back to their homes. Those who did return had been fundamentally transformed. The Maine state records held testimony from a survivor, so deeply disturbing that officials kept it classified for more than 100 years. This evening we expose the real events that occurred within the granite walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we proceed with the tale of the Convent of Eternal Tears, this channel caters to a specific audience. Only the most courageous individuals who venture to explore America's most sinister historical periods. Should you possess the bravery to discover what truly transpired in the hidden corners of our nation's past, click the subscribe button and tell us in the comments which state you're tuning in from. Do you have sufficient courage to become part of our community of genuine mystery enthusiasts? Let's explore this together. What makes this account especially terrifying is that it wasn't motivated by religious extremism or otherworldly phenomena, but by something much more frightening: the methodical quest for knowledge regardless of human suffering, concealed beneath a veneer of Christian compassion. During the final years of the 18th century, the Maine district remained under Massachusetts jurisdiction, a frontier region where separated settlements fought to endure brutal winters and even more brutal circumstances. The harbor town of Millbridge, home to scarcely 300 residents, functioned as a commercial hub for timber traders and fishermen bold enough to traverse the dangerous Atlantic waters. 15 miles through thick woodland marked solely by indigenous hunting paths sat a piece of property that would become associated with unmentionable atrocities. The Ashford women came to Millbridge on a dreary October dawn in 1798. Their horse-pulled cart filled with enigmatic containers and medical provisions that attracted inquisitive stares from local citizens. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford descended from the cart with the dignity of European aristocracy, an impressive woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn locks and intense gray eyes that appeared to document every aspect of her environment. Her speech carried the polished accent of refined English society, and her demeanor indicated someone used to authority and complete submission. Sister Prudence Ashford appeared next, a towering lean woman of 30 with ivory skin and hands that moved with the exact elegance of a skilled artisan. Her fingers were lengthy and pale with remarkable steadiness that would later become vital to her horrifying work. Unlike her superior, Prudence rarely spoke, watching the world through light blue eyes that disclosed nothing of her intentions. When she did communicate, her voice contained hints of a Scottish accent, cultured yet with an underlying frigidity that made even seasoned frontiersmen uneasy. The youngest member, novice Temperance Ashford, seemed to barely exceed 22 years. She possessed disturbing beauty that immediately drew attention: jet black hair, porcelain complexion, and dark eyes that appeared to contain age-old mysteries. Yet something unsettling existed about her attractiveness, a characteristic that made mothers reflexively draw their children nearer when she walked by. Her smile failed to reach her eyes, and she possessed a disturbing tendency to examine people as though they were exhibits in a display. The Ashford women professed to be Anglican sisters, escaping religious oppression in England, hoping to create a new religious community in the American frontier. They possessed convincing recommendation letters from English church authorities, documents that would eventually be exposed as expert falsifications. Their account was persuasive enough to satisfy Millbridge's Protestant community, who regarded the arrival of educated religious women as a civilizing force on their harsh frontier town, using gold pieces that appeared limitless. The sisters bought nearly 200 acres of secluded forest property from a thankful widow who had been unable to settle her deceased husband's obligations. The amount they offered, 3 times the property's evaluated worth, caused surprise but also guaranteed enthusiastic support from local officials. They promptly employed every available carpenter, stonemason, and worker in the area to build their religious sanctuary. The structure that emerged from the wilderness during the subsequent 8 months was unlike any religious building the workers had encountered. 3 levels of gray stone extracted from the nearby shoreline, with walls thick enough to silence any noise from inside. The windows were remarkably small and placed high on the walls, making it impossible to see interior spaces from ground level. Most unusual was the underground level, which demanded extensive digging and strengthened foundations far exceeding what would be necessary for basic storage. When asked about the peculiar design, Mother Superior Agatha responded with a calm smile that repentance demands isolation, and isolation demands appropriate containment. Our sisters in England have discovered that spiritual recovery works best when the penitent is entirely separated from earthly distractions. The reasoning satisfied most listeners, though some of the senior workers quietly questioned why a house of worship needed to resemble a fortress so closely. The Ashford women oversaw every construction detail with careful attention. They demanded specific alterations that seemed odd to the builders: strengthened doors with substantial locks, drainage systems capable of managing large liquid volumes, and ventilation passages that appeared more suitable for a medical facility than a convent. When workers inquired about these elements, the sisters referenced their experience with comparable religious institutions in Europe, asserting these were standard features for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the traveling physician who moved between frontier communities, became one of the sisters' earliest and most passionate advocates. A man in his 50s with a reputation for progressive medical thinking, Dr. Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent understanding of feminine psychology and mental conditions. During their initial meeting, he was astounded by their advanced comprehension of disorders that most physicians barely acknowledged. The sisters demonstrate extraordinary insight into feminine hysteria and depression, he recorded in his journal. Their approaches, while unconventional, are founded on solid medical principles that I suspect are decades beyond current American practice. They discuss methods for addressing the fundamental causes of mental disturbance rather than simply managing symptoms. What Dr. Hartwell failed to document in his official journal was the private discussion he had with Mother Superior Agatha regarding the financial arrangements for their partnership. In return for directing challenging cases to the convent and supplying medical materials through his connections, Dr. Hartwell would receive substantial monthly compensation and access to comprehensive case studies that could advance his own medical profession. For a physician struggling to earn a living on the frontier, it was an opportunity too valuable to decline. The convent's reputation expanded throughout the territory with extraordinary speed. Families from communities as distant as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston started hearing whispered endorsements about the Ashford Sisters' miraculous capacity to convert problematic women into exemplary citizens. The price was high: $20 silver for 1 month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they termed complete reformation. But for desperate families dealing with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it appeared a small cost for peace and respectability. The categories of women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social concerns of early 19th century America. Unwed mothers who refused to disclose their lovers' identities arrived alongside wives who had publicly questioned their husband's authority. Daughters who rejected arranged marriages were delivered to the same institution that received women who had shown excessive interest in literature or politics. The connecting factor was defiance, women who had somehow stepped beyond the restrictive limits of acceptable feminine conduct. Religious conflicts of the period also influenced the convent's clientele. Puritan families occasionally sent daughters who had expressed interest in Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglican families disposed of daughters attracted to the emotional intensity of Baptist revival gatherings. The Ashford Sisters welcomed all denominations with equal enthusiasm, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The initial sign that something was fundamentally wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears occurred on a frigid February evening in 1803, when young Thomas Brewster was hunting in the woods surrounding the mysterious institution. The 20-year-old trapper had been following a wounded deer for hours through the snow-covered wilderness when strange sounds drew his attention toward the stone building that loomed dark against the winter landscape. Thomas had grown up in these forests and recognized every natural sound: the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But what he heard that night was different, deeply wrong, and unmistakably human. Through the snow-heavy air came screaming that rose and fell in waves, sometimes diminishing to desperate whimpers before erupting again into raw, primal shrieks of agony that made his blood freeze in his veins. Abandoning his wounded prey, Thomas crept closer to the convent, his heart pounding as the terrible sounds continued. The building appeared completely dark from outside, but as he circled toward the back, he noticed a faint glow coming from basement windows that were partially concealed by snowdrifts. The screaming grew louder as he approached, and with it came other sounds: the clink of metal instruments, urgent whispered conversations, and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Through a partially frosted basement window, Thomas glimpsed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a surgical theater, brilliantly lit by dozens of oil lamps and candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. A woman was secured to a wooden table with leather restraints, her head held immobile by a metal apparatus that looked more like a torture device than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her usually pale face flushed with concentration as she manipulated what appeared to be a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head was partially shaved, revealing pale scalp marked with dark lines drawn in ink. Most horrifying of all, there was clearly an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone, and something darker underneath that he realized with sick horror was brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain, but what made the scene even more nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as if she were documenting a routine medical procedure. Novice Temperance held additional instruments, passing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced efficiency of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued working with methodical precision, apparently untroubled by the fact that their patient was no longer responsive to their ministrations, unable to witness any more. Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. The image of that basement chamber burned itself into his memory, the casual efficiency of the procedures, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the realization that this was clearly not the first time such horrors had occurred within those stone walls. When Thomas reached town the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery with such frantic intensity that his father feared the boy had suffered a mental breakdown. The elder Brewster, a practical man who valued community stability above all else, listened with growing alarm as his son described scenes that seemed to belong in Gothic novels rather than a respectable religious institution. Thomas, his father, said carefully, "You were hunting alone in a blizzard in the dark after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some kind. The sisters are known to treat various feminine ailments that require intimate intervention." But Thomas's description was too detailed, too specific to be dismissed as hallucination or misunderstanding. He could describe the layout of the basement chamber, the specific instruments he had observed, and most convincingly, the clinical manner in which the procedures were being conducted. This wasn't the random violence of madness, but something far more sinister, systematic, methodical, and clearly practiced. The elder Brewster decided to consult with Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a cautious man who had built his reputation on careful judgment and community harmony. The Ashford Sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and maintaining perfect decorum in their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families currently had daughters and wives receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this nature could destroy reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not common criminals. There must be a reasonable explanation for what the boy thinks he saw." However, the deacon was too responsible to ignore such serious allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, visiting the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor, a sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch visitors with judgmental eyes. Her manner was perfectly gracious and composed, showing no sign of anxiety or guilt as she served tea and inquired about his family's health with apparent genuine concern. When Deacon Morrison delicately mentioned that local hunters had reported unusual noises coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha's expression showed only mild concern and understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her cultured English accent, "we often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of night. The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many of their patients arrived in states of severe spiritual distress, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that fought desperately against the purifying power of Christian discipline. Some women, she continued, with sympathetic sadness, have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the process of extraction requires considerable effort. The sounds your hunters heard were likely the cries of demons being cast out through the power of prayer and penance. The explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The concept of spiritual warfare was familiar to all frontier Christians, and the idea that particularly corrupted souls might require extreme measures for their salvation was not unreasonable within the religious context of the era. Mother Superior Agatha then offered to show him through the upper levels of the convent, leading him through Spartan but clean dormitory rooms where several women sat in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison noticed they seemed unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. When he attempted to make eye contact with them, they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if their attention was focused on something invisible in the distance. When the deacon asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained that they served as the convent's intensive spiritual counseling facilities for women requiring the most focused attention. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she said with a modest smile. "Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption require private examination of the soul that would compromise the patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation seemed reasonable within the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had indeed misinterpreted what he had witnessed. However, something continued to trouble him during the ride home, a subtle wrongness that he couldn't quite identify, but couldn't shake from his thoughts. The women he had observed seemed too quiet, too controlled, moving with an unnatural uniformity that reminded him more of sleepwalkers than conscious human beings. And there had been a smell throughout the building that he couldn't quite place, not just the expected odor of medicine and cleaning solutions, but something else underneath, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering had been so thick it seemed to coat the inside of his throat. Following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford Sisters implemented additional security measures that made their operations even more secretive. The loud screaming that had alerted Thomas Brewster was replaced by an eerie silence that somehow seemed more ominous than the previous nocturnal disturbances. Local families continued sending their troubled women to the convent, and the sisters continued accepting them with open arms and increasingly sophisticated promises of transformation. However, observant residents began noticing disturbing patterns that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the treatments being administered behind those stone walls. Women who entered the convent for spiritual correction often emerged months later as completely different people, not reformed or redeemed, but somehow fundamentally altered in ways that defied explanation. Mary Prescott had been a spirited young woman of 19, known throughout Millbridge for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence that had scandalized her family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable young men. Her parents, mortified by her public displays of willfulness, had finally sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare her for proper married life. When Mary returned home, her parents were initially delighted by the transformation. Gone was the rebellious daughter who had argued about everything from household duties to religious doctrine. In her place was a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when directly addressed and never expressed personal opinions or desires. She accepted the first marriage proposal that came her way with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or preference about the match. But as weeks passed, Mary's parents grew increasingly concerned about their daughter's condition. She displayed no recognition of favorite foods, cherished possessions, or childhood friends. When shown letters she had written before her treatment, she stared at them without comprehension, as if looking at documents written by a complete stranger. Most disturbing of all, she showed no emotional reaction to anything, neither joy nor sorrow. Pleasure nor pain seemed to register in her consciousness. Dr. Hartwell, when consulted about Mary's condition, praised the sister's work as a complete success. "The patient has been cured of the mental defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood," he declared confidently. "The rebellious spirit that caused her family such distress has been completely eliminated through proper spiritual discipline." However, Mary's mother noticed details that troubled her deeply. Her daughter bore unusual scars on her scalp, partially hidden by her hair but visible during washing and brushing. The scars formed a pattern that suggested some kind of deliberate procedure rather than accidental injury. When questioned about them, Mary showed no memory of how they had been acquired, stating simply that she remembered nothing about her time at the convent, except praying very hard to become a better woman. Similar transformations occurred with increasing frequency as the convent's reputation spread throughout New England. Hannah Morse, sent for treatment of melancholia following the death of her infant son, returned home after 3 months as an unnaturally cheerful woman who claimed to have no memory of ever having a child. When shown the baby's clothing and toys, she displayed no recognition or emotional response, as if that entire chapter of her life had been completely erased from her memory. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most disturbing. The merchant's wife had been committed to the convent for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce, scandalous behavior that threatened both families' social standing. When she returned after 4 months of treatment, she not only retracted her accusations but insisted she had never made them. More troubling still, she seemed to have no memory of the events that had led to her commitment, describing her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband as beyond reproach. Elizabeth's physical condition was also concerning. She complained of severe headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time, and family members noticed that she often seemed confused about basic information, forgetting the names of longtime friends, becoming lost in familiar neighborhoods, and struggling with simple tasks that had once been second nature to her. Like the other reformed women, she bore mysterious scars on her scalp and claimed no memory of how they had been acquired. Dr. Hartwell continued his enthusiastic endorsement of the Ashford methods, though his own behavior grew increasingly erratic as the years passed. The once respected physician began drinking heavily and often spoke in rambling monologues about advancing medical science and necessary sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. His journal entries from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a man wrestling with his conscience while justifying increasingly horrific actions. The procedures I have witnessed challenge every principle of medical ethics I was taught, yet the results are undeniable. The sisters have achieved what European physicians only theorize about: the ability to alter personality, suppress specific memories, and modify behavior through direct surgical intervention in the brain. Their documentation is meticulous, their methodology sound, their results consistent and reproducible. History will judge whether we are pioneers advancing human knowledge or monsters exploiting human suffering. The flow of correspondence between the convent and various European medical institutions intensified dramatically during this period. Local postal workers, though sworn to confidentiality through generous payments, couldn't help but notice the volume of packages and letters bearing foreign addresses. The Ashford Sisters were receiving regular shipments of medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds, while sending out detailed reports and what appeared to be preserved biological specimens. Mother Superior Agatha began making monthly trips to Portland and Boston, always returning with crates of supplies and equipment that required careful handling. She explained to curious locals that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders, combining traditional spiritual healing with the latest advances in European medical science. Her cultured manner and obvious education made these explanations seem plausible to a community that valued both religious faith and scientific progress. But some residents remained deeply suspicious of the changes they observed in the convent's patients. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had undergone treatment and returned fundamentally altered, began quietly questioning other families about their experiences. She discovered a disturbing pattern: none of the women who had received intensive treatment in the basement facilities could remember anything about their time at the convent except fragments of prayers and religious instruction. Investigation revealed another troubling fact: several women had simply never returned from the convent at all. When families inquired about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford Sisters claimed these women had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to remain as permanent residents, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. However, families who requested to visit these supposed residents were politely but firmly turned away, told that the women had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion that prohibited any contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened when Martha learned that the convent was accepting women from increasingly distant locations. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston were sending their most problematic daughters to the remote Maine institution. apparently willing to pay substantial sums and travel great distances for the promise of complete behavioral transformation. The fees had risen accordingly. The sisters now charged up to $500 for what they termed comprehensive reformation, a process that typically required 6 months and guaranteed permanent elimination of all undesirable traits and tendencies. As the convent entered its second decade of operation, the Ashford Sisters had established themselves as recognized authorities on feminine mental disorders throughout the medical communities of both America and Europe. Their carefully crafted reputation attracted attention from some of the most prominent physicians and researchers of the era, men who were fascinated by the detailed case studies and remarkable success rates documented in the sisters' regular correspondence with medical institutions. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School became one of their most dedicated correspondents, maintaining a regular exchange of letters that lasted for over 15 years. In his communications, preserved in the Harvard archives, he expressed amazement at the sophistication of their research. Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature. The precision with which you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggests a level of understanding that our profession will not achieve for decades. What Dr. Whitmore didn't realize was that he was reading clinical descriptions of procedures that would later be recognized as primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford Sisters had developed a sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only theorize about. Based on animal studies and post-mortem examinations, the sisters' research methodology was disturbingly thorough. They maintained detailed records of each patient's personality traits, behavioral patterns, and psychological characteristics before treatment, then documented every aspect of their experimental procedures with scientific precision. Observations tracked changes in memory, personality, cognitive function, and behavior with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized legitimate medical research. Air surgical techniques evolved significantly during this period. Sister Prudence had become remarkably skilled at what she termed targeted cranial intervention, developing methods for accessing specific regions of the brain through carefully calculated entry points. Her detailed anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, showed various approaches to different brain structures with precise measurements and angles that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy. The procedures themselves were conducted with clinical detachment that made them even more horrifying. Patients were typically sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but not enough to eliminate consciousness entirely. The sisters needed their subjects to remain responsive, so they could monitor the effects of their interventions in real time. They would ask questions, give commands, and observe changes in behavior as they manipulated different brain regions with their instruments. Novice Temperance had evolved into the group's expert on what they called psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She developed elaborate protocols for reinforcing the effects of surgical procedures through carefully designed programs of reward and punishment, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure. Her methods included controlled nutrition, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, and social isolation, all calibrated to break down existing personality structures and rebuild them according to desired specifications. The sisters also pioneered the use of various chemical compounds to enhance their experimental results. Through their network of medical contacts, they obtained access to substances that wouldn't be available to mainstream medicine for decades. They experimented with different drug combinations, documenting their effects on consciousness, memory, and susceptibility to psychological manipulation with the same systematic approach they brought to their surgical work. By 1815, the convent had processed over 400 women through their various treatment programs. The sisters maintained detailed statistical records showing success rates that exceeded 90%, though their definition of success was the complete elimination of whatever personality, traits or behaviors had prompted a patient's commitment to their care. Women who died during treatment were recorded as failures, and their bodies preserved for further study. The scope of their operations expanded dramatically during this period. They began accepting what they termed research volunteers, typically destitute women with no family connections who were offered food, shelter, and modest compensation in exchange for participating in experimental treatments designed to advance medical understanding of the feminine mind. These women, often prostitutes, vagrants, or widows with no means of support, provided the sisters with test subjects for their most experimental procedures. The documentation from these experiments, later discovered in hidden archives throughout the convent, reveals a systematic approach to human experimentation that was both methodical and horrifying. The sisters recorded precise measurements of skull dimensions, detailed descriptions of brain tissue reactions to various stimuli, and careful observations of the relationship between specific surgical interventions and behavioral changes. They also maintained extensive correspondence with researchers throughout Europe and America, selling their findings to medical institutions that were unable or unwilling to conduct such studies themselves. The letters reveal a thriving black market in human experimentation data, with the Ashford Sisters serving as primary suppliers of information that couldn't be obtained through legitimate research methods. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became one of their most lucrative customers, paying substantial sums for detailed documentation of personality modification through surgical intervention. His letters, intercepted decades later by authorities, specifically requested information about procedures for eliminating specific memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating what he termed compliant behavioral states in female subjects. At the University of Edinburgh, ironically, the same institution that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan years earlier, unknowingly, purchased research data from their former colleague through intermediaries who didn't reveal the true source of the information. The university's medical school incorporated the Ashford findings into their curriculum, teaching surgical techniques and psychological theories that were based on systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. Perhaps most chilling of all, the sisters began accepting commissions for specific types of behavioral modification. Wealthy families could request particular personality changes in their problematic relatives, eliminating artistic interests, reducing intellectual curiosity, suppressing romantic attachments, or creating perfect domestic compliance. The sisters developed specialized procedures for each type of modification, charging premium prices for their increasingly sophisticated services. The careful facade that had protected the Ashford Sisters for nearly 2 decades began to show its first serious cracks in the winter of 1818, when a young woman named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent under circumstances that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. Unlike the broken, desperate women who typically sought the sisters' help, Sarah came as a fighter, possessed of an intelligence and strength of will that had not been crushed by the social pressures that usually preceded commitment to the institution. Sarah's crime was having given birth to a child out of wedlock and steadfastly refusing to reveal the father's identity despite months of pressure from her wealthy Boston family. Her parents, prominent merchants with a reputation to protect, had initially attempted to arrange a discreet marriage or adoption that would preserve family honor. When Sarah rejected both options, insisting on her right to keep her child and live independently, they declared her mentally unstable and arranged for her commitment to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At 24, Sarah possessed a formidable intellect that had been nurtured by progressive parents until her pregnancy made her an embarrassment. She had received an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her era, including exposure to medical texts through her father's connections with Boston physicians. This background gave her knowledge that would prove crucial to recognizing the true nature of the Ashford sisters' activities. From the moment of her arrival, Sarah understood that the convent was not what it appeared to be. The other residents moved with the mechanical precision of people whose personalities had been fundamentally altered, their responses unnaturally controlled and their eyes disturbingly vacant. Many bore visible scars on their scalps, partially concealed by hair that had been allowed to grow back over surgical sites. Most telling of all, several women displayed clear symptoms of brain damage, difficulty with speech, memory problems, and personality changes so dramatic they seemed like entirely different people. Sarah's medical knowledge allowed her to recognize these symptoms for what they were, the results of deliberate surgical intervention in the brain. During her first week at the convent, she was subjected to the same preliminary examinations that preceded all intensive treatments, detailed measurements of her skull, extensive questioning about her personality traits and behaviors, and physical tests that seemed designed to map her neurological responses rather than assess her spiritual condition. The Ashford sisters were initially puzzled by Sarah's resistance to their standard conditioning procedures. Most patients, already broken by social shame and family rejection, quickly submitted to the convent's authority structure. Sarah, however, maintained her defiance even under increasingly harsh treatment, designed to break down her psychological defenses and prepare her for more intensive intervention. She was placed in solitary confinement for days at a time, denied adequate food and water, and subjected to hours of psychological abuse designed to destroy her sense of self-worth. Sister Temperance, the convent's expert in behavioral conditioning, employed every technique in her arsenal to break Sarah's will: sensory deprivation, temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and constant verbal assault on her character and worth as a human being. Through it all, Sarah remained alert and determined to escape. She used her time in isolation to mentally map the convent's layout, memorize the sisters' routines, and plan her eventual flight to freedom. More importantly, she began documenting her observations in a makeshift journal, written on scraps of paper with ink made from berry juice and hidden in the seams of her clothing. Sarah's breakthrough came during a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when flooding in the basement disrupted the convent's normal operations. The sisters were forced to relocate equipment and patients to higher floors, creating confusion that gave Sarah the opportunity she had been waiting for. In the chaos of moving materials and managing crisis, she slipped away from her guards and began exploring areas of the building that were normally strictly forbidden to patients. What she discovered in the basement chambers exceeded her worst fears. The flooded rooms contained evidence of procedures that defied comprehension: operating tables equipped with restraints designed to immobilize patients completely, collections of surgical instruments unlike anything used in conventional medicine, and most horrifying of all, preserved specimens of human